Well, hello there, my beautiful friends. Today we are going to be swatching the brand spanking new Dragon Prism 2 palette from Enchanted Lustre Cosmetics. From what I see on Instagram, a lot of you guys are excited about this palette, so we're going to be swatching it here today. So if you are interested in seeing what the Dragon Prism 2 palette is all about, then go ahead and keep on watching, and let's jump right on in. So if you are no stranger to my channel, then you've probably heard me talk about Enchanted Lustre Cosmetics before here in one of my videos, because I talk about them pretty frequently. I absolutely love the brand. I love the owner. She's a total sweetheart. And I love almost all of the products that I've tried from the brand. They're fantastic. And when the Dragon Prism 2 palette was announced, I was very excited, but I've never been able to purchase the Dragon Prism 1 palette because it's always been sold out and she's been restocking it and I always miss out on it some way, somehow. But she offered to send me the Dragon Prism 2 palette in PR, which is so freaking sweet, and she sent me the cutest little note attached to it. She's just an absolute doll and I really appreciated it. But I just want you guys to know, full disclosure, this was sent to me as PR. But all of these opinions, of course, are 100% my own, and the PR doesn't sway my opinion on any of these shadows. But total disclosure aside, I have had about a week to try this palette out and I have been testing it and playing with it. And the Dragon Prism 2 palette retails for $96 US or 150 Australian dollars, which sounds expensive at first, but this is an all multi-chromatic palette. Now, multi-chrome eyeshadows usually range from, I would say, like $6, I think is the cheapest I've seen it, to anywhere to like $25 per shadow. So all that considered, there are 15 shades in this palette, which breaks everything down to about $6.40 per shadow, which is not bad by any means, especially for these beautiful multi-chromatic shimmery shadows. And they are 26mm pans, so they are just the standard eyeshadow size. Now, the Prism shadows are basically Enchanted Lustre's versions of multi-chromatic shadows. They are very, very creamy, very smooth. They're definitely a pressed powder eyeshadow, but they are like the softest and most emollient pressed powder shadows I think I've tried ever. They are beautiful and really easy to work with for the most part. Now, all of the prisms are vegan, cruelty-free, paraben-free, talc-free, and are blendable, so you can blend these out and they retain the pigmentation. But now that we have all the details aside about the palette, let's go ahead and get into the nitty-gritty and, of course, the beautiful swatches. But kicking off the palette here, we are starting with the first shade, Dark Prism, which is described as a dark bluey purple that shifts to red and has beautiful red shimmers in it. This is a traditional Prism formula, so it's very emollient, but it is a little thicker in texture. I find that all of these apply best with your finger, although they do apply really well with a brush. You just need to apply it over top of glitter glue just to ensure that everything lasts all day. But if you put down a base layer of glitter glue, it will last beautifully. This is the traditional formula, so it's kind of like in between a pressed kind of pigment and a foiled shadow. It's like a mix of both of them. And here we have the finger swatch. I basically just ran my finger into the pan and showed the payoff. And this is basically how I would apply it onto the eyes. About this much product, and I would obviously tap it over top of the glitter glue. As you can see, we have this beautiful like blueberry base color, and then you have that gorgeous red shift and those red shimmers, which gives it a bit of a purple hue. It is so rich and intense, and it applies so beautifully. As you can see, I'm swatching in real time here, and no, I don't mean to flip you off. That was just the easiest finger to use, so I am sorry. But I went ahead and applied this over a layer of glitter glue. There's a layer of glitter glue on all of the swatches that I use here today, just because that's how I would apply it on the eyes. But as you can see, that built up beautifully. You don't even need to dip back into the pan. It just applies so smoothly and so rich, and it's super impressive for a deep blueberry color like this one. Next up in the palette, we have the beautiful Mind Prism. Like, this is mesmerizing. I like that it's called Mind Prism because it just looks like a crystal ball. It looks like something you would use to like hypnotize people. It's so stunning. But this is described as a purple, blue, and pink shifting shade. Now, I would say that this mostly has like a purpley aqua teal situation happening, and then you have some pink and blue shimmers in it. This color to me just looks like a crystal. It looks like aquamarine. It is absolutely gorgeous. Like, I'm hypnotized just staring at it right now. And this guy definitely has a traditional prism formula. So it's like that cross between pressed pigment and a foiled eyeshadow. It's got the creaminess of a foiled eyeshadow, but the payoff and the shine of a pressed pigment, if that makes sense. It's a very easy to work with and user-friendly formula because it picks up so well on a finger and on a brush. As you can see, I am applying it over top of glitter glue here on my arm, and that applies so beautifully. My application was kind of messy, so I just cleaned up that little line that I made in between the two shadows with a makeup wipe. So if you're wondering why it looks a little different here, that is why. But this shadow is stunning. This is like the most beautiful aquamarine teal purpley situation. It is so gorgeous, and it is so reminiscent of mermaids and dragons, and it is just a really interesting and unique shade. If you are into colorful multichrome shadows, this is definitely one to try out. Now, the next shade is probably my favorite in the whole palette, but I'm having a hard time choosing which one is my favorite. This is Terra Prism, and I don't really think I need to explain why this is my favorite. I think it's pretty self-explanatory if you know me. But this is described as an earthy purple red shifting to deep green and gold, and I would say that this is mostly a shimmery foiled finish. It's got the texture of a foiled eyeshadow, but it has those beautiful pink and red and orange shimmers in it almost. This shadow looks like a cosmic sunset. It has those beautiful red orangey tones, and then it has that beautiful kind of earthy, purpley, almost green base. It's such an interesting mix of colors, and it is so incredibly pigmented and very smooth as well. It has so many shimmers in it, but the shadow is so smooth and easy to work with. Like, look at that swatch. It is so easy to work with, it's insane. It is a really beautiful color. Now, I did apply one more coat of this off screen just because my swatch was really ugly, but I love the base tone to this shadow. It really does have a green, purpley, earthy kind of vibe that's really interesting, and because it has that more kind of greeny, mossy undertone, you can definitely pair it down or pair it up depending on what matte shades you use in the crease. If you wanted to pair it up, you could use a purple. If you wanted to pair it down a little bit and make it a bit more neutral, you could use some cooler browns or even some green. This is definitely a standout shade in the palette. Next up, we have Flare Prism, and this is described as a golden red shifting to teal and olive. And I would say that this is also a shimmery foiled finish. The texture of this shadow is very similar to Terra Prism, where it's almost a foiled finish, but it has those beautiful shimmers in it, but it's very pigmented and easy to work with. This shade is so stinking beautiful. I love shimmery olives like this. I used to be completely opposed to anything green, anything olive, mustard, anything like that. I was opposed to it, but I have learned to love shades like this, and it is because of shades like this. As you can see, we have that beautiful mossy kind of goldy green base, and then it has these beautiful bright gold shimmers running throughout it, so it makes it look a lot brighter in the actual swatch and on the eye than it does in the pan. It's much more of a bright, almost orangey gold mixed with a bit of green, which makes it really interesting. This is the most beautiful shade to just throw on the lid and call it a day. I went through a phase of only using, I think it was from Natasha Denona's Mothership 5 palette. The green shade in that palette is very reminiscent of this color. Honestly, I like this color a little bit better because of the kind of yellowy gold aspect to it. It makes it a bit more wearable, quote unquote, some would say. Although everyone's definition of wearable is definitely different. But it makes it a bit more just neutral, a bit more toned down while still having those beautiful light catching shimmers. And the last shade in the top row is called Sonic Prism, which I thought of Sonic the Hedgehog. I don't know about you guys, but this color kind of looks like him too a little bit. But this is described as a forest green with a champagne gold shift. I know that sounds like to die for. And I would say that this formula is pretty reminiscent of the last two, the more foiled kind of shimmery finish. Very, very creamy, very easy to pick up on a finger or a brush, but does have those beautiful shimmers as well. So as you can see, like, this color is absolutely to die for. I love that this is a foresty, almost cool toned green with not only gold shimmers but champagne shimmers as well. It gives it a really unique sheen and a really bright sheen. I've never quite seen an eyeshadow like this. I've seen a lot of green golds and even some teal golds that are really beautiful, but because of the champagne shimmers and the champagne shift that is in the shadow, it gives it a really unique undertone. It almost reminds me of like a sage green once you get all of the shimmers in there and once you see the swatch. Just because of the way it hits the light, it does make it a little bit more cool toned, which I think is really interesting, and like I said, this is a very unique shadow. Now, this guy swatches like a dream, like the rest of them. The last three in particular have swatched like butter. I mean, legit butter. It is such a unique shade, and the shift is so bright. Look at that shift. It is absolutely to die for. In the shade, it definitely looks deeper, and then once the shadow hits the light, it brightens it up so much. So this is the perfect like center of the lid kind of shadow that's just gonna hit the light so beautifully and reflect so nicely. It is absolutely stunning. This whole top row is like earthy dragon perfection. So if the last row was earthy dragon perfection, then I would say that this next upcoming row is more earthy mermaid perfection, if that makes sense, because we have much more aquas and pinks and kind of brighter purples in this row. So it's definitely a good one. But this first shade is called Cosmo Prism, which I think is a really cute name. It reminds me of the Cosmos from Animal Crossing. If you guys know what I'm talking about, then you're a nerd like me. This shade is described as a rich indigo purple that shifts to a beautiful pinky red and has these gorgeous like hot pink shimmers running throughout it. So it literally looks like indigo mixed with royal blue that has all these beautiful pink shimmers and shifts to a pinky red situation. It is a really interesting shadow that has a very rich and intense base to it, but the shimmers are pretty darn bright, so it gives it a really intense shift. Which, if we're going for a shade like this, you want something very intense and saturated with pigment. And this is exactly that. Now, it was a little bit difficult to capture the pink shift on camera. I think you can really see it here when I tilt my finger. You can really see that pink shift. It's a little harder to see in the actual swatch, but you can still see a little bit of that pink coming through, and in person it was very, very intense. So if any of you folks are blue eyeshadow lovers, but you also happen to really enjoy pink eyeshadows, this is definitely the shade for you. You see what I'm talking about? In the actual swatch itself, just on my arm, just for some reason I wasn't able to capture the pink shift, but you could see it on my finger in the previous clip. And it was very present in person. And this is a shadow that will definitely catch the attention of others. Speaking of catching the attention of others, we have the shadow that caught my attention when I first saw this palette. This is where my eye immediately was drawn to. This is Dream Prism, and this shadow is just to die for. It is like the most beautiful iridescent baby blue. And this is described as a baby blue flaky base that shifts to a baby pink and lavender with some shimmers running throughout it, baby pink shimmers and lavender shimmers. Now, this is a topper shadow, so like all topper shadows, the texture is definitely a lot thicker. And I would go ahead and pat your finger into the actual pan. I would not swipe your finger back and forth because that's going to disturb the product. I would just lightly pat your finger into the pan, and I would start the application by just tapping your finger over top of your lid or whatever shadow you're using, just like I did just a moment ago in the swatch here. And then you can go ahead and use your finger to blend it out a little bit. It'll kind of smooth the texture out. But this to me is very reminiscent of those little flaky mica pots that a lot of these indie brands have, the really beautiful multi-chromatic flakes. I'm sure you've seen them before, but this is a pressed version, so it's much easier to use than those flakes because those flakes are like virtually weightless. You can literally blow it into one of those little pots and all the flakes will go flying everywhere. I did it one time. But I don't think I've ever seen a color represent cotton candy better than Dream Prism. This is like the color of cotton candy, the beautiful baby pink and the baby blue, which makes me very hungry because a girl loves some cotton candy flavored ice cream, and this is making me crave it. And it is an absolutely stunning shade, and I think it's really unique as well. I've never quite seen a color that looks as pastel and as bright as this one, as far as blue and pink goes. So now we're jumping into my second favorite eyeshadow in the palette, and I think it's pretty easy to see why. This is Charmed Prism. This is described as a light lavender pink that shifts from purple to aqua blue with beautiful teal aqua shimmers running throughout it. This is such a gorgeous eyeshadow. It's a topper shadow, so it's kind of similar to Dream Prism, but I wouldn't describe it as like one of those multi-chrome flaky bases. It's more of a traditional shimmery top coat type of eyeshadow. So when you apply a layer of this, it looks very, not sparse, it just looks translucent almost. The base of it is very translucent, but you get those beautiful aqua and light purple shimmers. And if you build it up with a few layers, it definitely gets a bit darker and you can see more of that purple base peeking through. I think you can see on my finger what I'm talking about. It's almost like one of those translucent based eyeshadows. Now Huda Beauty in her neon pink palette has a shade that is identical to this one, so this is a really good dupe for that. I think this formula is creamier and easier to work with, and it builds up easier as well. But as you can see, when I apply it, it looks almost non-existent almost in the light, but then once you build it up a little bit, you can see the shift. It's one of those transformer shadows. So if you pop this over top of some of the blues that are in here or some of the darker purples, it is just going to bring those colors alive. And of course, if you wear this on the lid by itself, it's going to give a very glossy yet still iridescent effect. It looks very glossy on my arm, almost like my arm has a little bit of lip gloss on it, which I absolutely adore that look on the eyes. So this is definitely right up my alley. So here is another favorite of mine. The next shade in the palette is called CHRONO Prism, and this is described as an antique gold that shifts into a teal blue. And I would definitely say this formula is more foiled and shimmery. It is very, very intense. You need just the lightest amount of product. It picks up so beautifully on a finger and on a brush. You'll see in the swatch, but it is a very intense shadow that is very concentrated. Now in the pan, it might look similar to Flare Prism from the first row, but CHRONO Prism has more of a golden green base, where Flare Prism had much more of an orangey red light gold situation. The overall base of that shadow was much more golden and had those beautiful orange shimmers, and the green was more of an undertone versus this shade, which definitely puts the green first. You get that beautiful green shift and that antique gold shift as well. So on the eyes, it looks much more green gold than Flare Prism, which looked much more orangey gold and almost a red gold, if that makes sense. This guy's more green in tone, and as you can see in the swatch, you can see what I'm talking about here. The golden undertones really pop, but the green undertones are very present as well. This shade reminds me of a shade from one of the Natasha Denona palettes. I think it was the gold palette or the green palette. I don't remember the name of it. I'm sorry, but there was a shade in that palette that reminded me so much of this one. There are a lot of Enchanted Lustre shades that remind me of Natasha Denona and Pat McGrath shadows, which is always a plus for me, because those are expensive, and anytime I can get some cheaper dupes that are better in formula or on par in formula, then I am a very happy gal. Next up in the palette, we have Toxic Prism, which is described as a dark shimmery green that shifts to a dark aqua teal. I can definitely see the aqua in this shadow, but I also see some orange reflex. So I think it's a really interesting combination of colors, because you get that warmth from the orange reflex, but then you also get that kind of coolness from the aqua green. It's very reminiscent of one of the shades from earlier Sonic Prism, but Sonic Prism was a lot brighter and a lot more reflective, a lot more champagne based because of that champagne undertone, which reads on the eyes as a much more sage green with a beautiful warm orangey reflect and undertone. It's a really beautiful shadow, and the reflect is absolutely stunning. It reminds me of like a scarab beetle, which sounds kind of gross because we're talking about beetles and eyeshadow here. Well, actually, I believe that's already a thing. Isn't that what carmine is? But I digress. The colors in this shadow just remind me of a beautiful iridescent scarab beetle. And as you can see, this is one of those foiled shimmery finishes, so it's very easy to work with, and it is very creamy and emollient in texture. It goes onto the eyes so smoothly and beautifully. I barely had to put that on the skin to get to this application, to get to this pigmentation. And that is such a smooth application of product. It doesn't have any chunkiness anywhere. It just applied beautifully. It like glides onto the skin. And it is a really beautiful color if you are someone who likes warmer orangey tones and you want to experiment with a little bit of green. This is the shade for you. Now we have the epitome of a mermaid colored eyeshadow. This is Aqua Prism, and I couldn't have named that any better. It is the definition of mermaid aqua goodness. But this is described as a deep aqua to a deep blue. And on Enchanted Lustre's Instagram, she says that this reminds you of an enchanted green lake at night filled with sea peacocks. And I'm just imagining that, and it just looks so beautiful in my head. I'm sure you're picturing something pretty similar. But I love that description. It really, truly is reminiscent of a peacock, but it has that gorgeous aqua teal situation happening. So it gives it kind of a mermaidy vibe. It gives it a bit more iridescence than just the typical peacock green color. I would describe this formula more as a traditional prism formula. So you just need to basically smooth it out a little bit. It doesn't have that kind of foiled base. But once you get to the desired pigmentation, it is such a beautiful color. And because this color does have a deeper toned peacock teal colored base, it definitely looks a bit more smoky, a little bit edgier than just your typical kind of teal metallic, which is why I think she described it as an enchanted green lake at night, because it does have that richer, deeper, kind of more smoky base. So now we are jumping into the iridescent, lighter toned shadows, which is like totally up my alley. This is the shade Gravity Prism, and this is described as a pale lavender base that shifts from mint green to a pale pink, and this is described as a shimmery topper shade. You can also use this as a shimmery highlighter as well. Now, the next three shadows reminded me so much of those really pretty, very expensive Jeffree Star shadows or Jeffree Star highlighters that came out earlier this year, I believe in January. They all had an appropriate name, so I'm not going to go ahead and repeat them because I got demonetized twice for that. So we're not going to repeat those today. But if you're like me and you wanted those three highlighters, but you didn't want to fork over $50 per highlight, yes, per highlight, then any of the next three that I'm going to show you are definitely ones to try out. This is a beautiful iridescent kind of lavender based shadow that has that really intense minty green reflect and shimmers. It is so beautiful. This would be gorgeous on the cheeks and on the eyes. It just works as such a beautiful little spotlight if you want a little bit of kind of like a hint of lavender with those gorgeous mint sparkles. And of course, this next one is my favorite of the topper iridescent shadows. I think it's obvious to see why, you know me and my pink iridescent loving tastes. But this is described as an iridescent white base that shifts from purple to green and to orange. And this guy isn't as shimmery as the other topper shades. It's more foiled, although it does have those beautiful pink and kind of baby blue shimmers. But it does have more of a foiled iridescent base, which I personally love. I love shadows that aren't just straight up shimmer, that have a bit more of a foiled base to them and then a very shimmery reflect through it. Look at the reflect in this shadow. This is like an exact dupe for that one Jeffree Star highlighter that got me demonetized. You know which one it is. That one. The one that I was absolutely dying to have. And this is an exact dupe, in my opinion. It is such a beautiful, highly foiled, highly glossy type of shade. I've already mentioned it, but I love glossy highlighters. I love glossy eyeshadows, and this is a beautiful, iridescent and reflective, multichromatic, glossy type of shade. This is beautiful on the eyes, on the inner corner, on the brow bone. You can use this on the cheeks, or you can use it over top of some of the deeper tones in this palette. There's a lot to play with here, and this is a shadow that pairs beautifully with a lot of the purples and the pinks and even some of the teals that we've seen thus far. So second to last here, we have Light Prism, and this is a really interesting shade. This is described as an iridescent pale gold that shifts to pale pink to light blue, and it has a little bit of mint shimmer in there as well. And this is one of those shimmer iridescent formulas. It's definitely a bit more reflective and a bit more shimmery than Power Prism, which had more of a foiled base. This is such an interesting shade to look at in the pan. I am like absolutely loving just staring at this right now. It is so wet looking in the pan. It literally looks like a cream formula. And on the finger, it looks like a periwinkle, kind of purpley blue almost. And then you get those beautiful mint and gold reflex. So it's a really interesting color. There's a shade that I own from Terra Moon Cosmetics called Saturn's Ring. It is a beautiful tone that looks pretty similar to this, but this one is much shimmerier. So this would be beautiful over top of any of the colors in the palette because it does have that kind of periwinkle base that would work really nicely with the pink and with some of those beautiful purples and the deeper indigos. This color kind of reminds me of a shade from the Natasha Denona Mothership 5 palette as well, which I believe was called Astral Luna Gold. I literally bought that palette for that shade. And if I would have seen this color sooner and before that palette came out, then I would have saved myself the $125 that I paid for that palette, for that one specific shade. Yes, I am still bitter about spending my money on that, but I'm really happy that there are colors out on the market now that are similar to Natasha Denona and similar to Pat McGrath without having to pay the Pat McGrath price tag. And last but certainly not least, we have Cristo Prism, which is an iridescent turquoise to warm light pink. And this shade is very unique to the palette. It has an iridescent satiny formula. So the overall shift in this particular shade is much more satiny than the others. It has shimmers in it, but they're much more subdued and you get like a very soft ethereal look. It just reminds me of like an ethereal glow. It reminds me of those beautiful like northern lights, I believe they're called, that appear up in, I think maybe Canada or Alaska. Clearly I'm very uneducated when it comes to this kind of stuff, but it reminds me of that kind of ethereal, minty glow type of eyeshadow. It's very glowy, if that makes sense, and I think you can see what I'm talking about. I love this shade. I've never seen a color like this. I've never really seen a formula like this that looks so glowy and still iridescent and still satiny while maintaining that beautiful pastel minty color. It is a very interesting eyeshadow, and I think if you are into minty colors or you're into lighter greens, this is definitely one to try on the eyes. This would be beautiful just all alone by itself all over the lid or over top of some of the deeper tones. And if you are somebody who can get down with a colorful highlight, I think this would be an absolutely beautiful minty glow that would just accent the cheeks beautifully because of the satiny glowy sheen that it has. It's such an interesting formula and such a unique color. I've never seen anything like this, which is so incredibly rare in the makeup world where we've seen things a million times. All of the shades in this palette are just so unique and beautiful, and she really did an amazing job with curating a collection of colors together that are really unique and fun. But that is going to be wrapping up today's video. I have been talking for like an hour, so I'm going to go ahead and hop off here. But I really hope that you enjoyed hearing about these shadows in the Dragon Prism 2 palette, and I really hope that you enjoyed seeing the swatches. I hope that it helped you decide whether or not you want to pick this palette up. And I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but you can purchase these shadows individually. I believe they're $6. But if you don't want to pick up the entire palette, but you do want to get a few shades, you do have the option to do so. But I really hope that you found today's video helpful, and if you did, I would love it if you gave me a big old thumbs up. And if you want to stick around and see more videos like this one and review more indie brands and just hear about indie brands in general, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below and join the fam. And a huge thank you to Enchanted Lustre Cosmetics for sending me this palette. I so incredibly appreciate it, and I just think it's the sweetest thing in the world that she would consider me to send PR to. I'm a small channel, you know, so that's pretty cool. But with that being said, I hope you are having an absolutely amazing and beautiful day wherever you are, and thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope to see you next time. Bye!